Preserving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their backs confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand that pulls strings.
Well, welcome, Radio Free America, to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. It's Tuesday morning, April 3rd, and we have a special couple of guests this morning. We're going to do a two-part show. Our first part is with Paul Dreesen. Paul is a fellow with the Heartland Institute. He also is very heavily involved with CFAC as a author, as an expert, and he has done several books, and the one we're going to be talking about today is something that's really in front of the public, and that is how the environmental movement, radical environmentalism, is really anti-humanist, and that certainly, by the time we get done with our program today, I think you will understand exactly that. Paul, are you on the call? And I welcome you to the show.
Well, thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, we've had you on a number of shows in the past, and I'll tell you, it's always one of our better programs when you do these shows, because you're very well spoken, but you're also let's say, very intolerant of stupidity. And I really appreciate hearing your views on radical environmentalism. And we're going to be talking about your book, Eco-Imperialism, Green Power, Black Death. And I read that book, now it's been probably a year and a half, 2 years ago. And it is really an excellent outline of what happens when the environmental movement gets their way, because their way is de-development, de-industrialization, and the destruction of all forms of electrical power that aren't so-called green power. And that means that a lot of underdeveloped countries around the world have very little access to affordable electricity and affordable power, and as a result, they end up staying undeveloped. And so, Paul, give us a little bit more, our listeners, a little more of your background. I couldn't do you justice the way I should, so I'll let you tell our listeners a little more about you and about what you've been doing, and then we'll get into this discussion on your book.
Well, that's very kind of you to give me such a kind introduction. Very glowing, and I appreciate that very much. My background is geology and field ecology. That's what I studied in college. Did a lot of work in those areas. Then I went to law school in environmental law, where I built on my previous education and did a lot of work in that area through an oil and gas trade association, the Western Governor's Office up in Wyoming. I came out to the Washington, D.C. area to work with then Senator Bill Armstrong, Republican from Colorado. I went over to the Department of the Interior, where I worked for Jim Watt and the rest of those guys during the Reagan years. And ultimately, I went off on my own, working with think tanks and various other organizations around the U.S. and the world on all kinds of energy and environmental topics. And that's when I wrote my book, Eco-Imperialism, followed that up with a couple of other books on climate change. Carbon dioxide is the miracle molecule that makes life on Earth possible. Cracking Big Green, taking an inside look at these radical environmental groups who collectively, just in the United States, have a $13 billion a year budget. So we're looking at some very powerful organizations with an awful lot of control and access to the media, access to government, strong desire to rule every aspect of our lives with no accountability almost ever back to them for the mistakes they make or the deliberate harm they inflict on people. And that's what I try to bring out in my talks, my books, my articles, let people know what's really going on here. Bear in mind, too, we've had tremendous environmental progress since 1970, so it's not like we're facing all kinds of imminent health and environmental destruction. We've cleaned up our environment, and what we're trying to get now from the environmental movement is a recognition of this, the fact that we're trying to get an extra couple percent of improvement that'll have no health benefits but will cost us trillions of dollars. So that's where I'm at.
Well, and Paul, that's something that you recognize. You're a free market capitalist. You understand that if we are going to improve our environment, if we are going to be able to do this, it takes money to generate the science and the technology to do this. And the underdeveloped countries are the worst offenders when it comes to pollution because they don't have the money to fund that technology. Why in the world are these radical environmentalists trying to deindustrialize the West and put us on the same plane as third world countries when in fact that means our environment will be much dirtier?
Well, that's an excellent point. What you're seeing with the environmentalists is, I think, rooted in the notion that we've got too many people on the planet, and keeping people impoverished and diseased and malnourished is a good way to get rid of a lot of people. They also claim that we use too many resources. We use, here in the United States, too much of the world's energy and natural resources, and yet they oppose any resource and energy development here in the United States, be it forest products, mining for metals and other minerals, oil and gas development, and yet they have no problem with converting millions or billions of acres of cropland and habitat land, even scenic areas and parklands, into wind and solar and biofuel plantations. We could get the same amount of energy out of the ground from just a few thousand acres. They want us to devote billions of acres to wind and solar power and biofuels instead. It makes no ecological, economic sense of any kind, no health and habitat sense. I can't really envision a good argument in favor of these things, but they have a tremendously effective propaganda machine tied in with the media and many governmental organizations. So they get their way, they push their point of view, even though when you sit down and try to speak rationally about it, it makes no sense.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you, and I always enjoy the comment that the socialists love humans, they love humanity, they just hate humans. And what it boils down to, you're right, they think there are far too many people on Earth. most of their programs are the ones that have created overpopulation, but at the same time, they use that as an excuse to do all sorts of things that will ultimately end up in people starving to death and a lot of other problems that they're creating. So it's kind of a 360 reasoning that's unreasonable.
It is indeed, and in that same vein, they completely ignore the very clear reality that people who have good health and living standards, abundant electricity, access to the modern living standards that we enjoy here in the United States, have far fewer children. People in developing countries have a lot of kids, A, because half of them die before they reach age 5, and B, because they need those extra hands to help in very marginal agricultural work. If they had modern agriculture, electricity, modern access to safe drinking water in hospitals, homes with window screens to keep disease-infested flies and mosquitoes out, their kids would live just as long as ours do, and the populations would actually end up going down, but in a very good, positive way, rather than trying to kill them off by denying people access to insecticides, modern foods, modern agriculture, abundant electricity that people can actually afford, all the modern aspects of society that we enjoy here in the United States and Europe.
No, you're right. And I guess that's the really positive thing about what you've done with your book, Eco-Imperialism, is point out exactly how these people in these third world countries, how miserable their existences are if, in fact, the environmental movement gets their way. Tell our listeners some of the things that you included. I know certainly the one that really stands out is the way they fix their meals, the way they cook, and many other things. But go ahead and tell our listeners some of the things that your research came up with.
Well, and I've seen a lot of this firsthand. Let me give you a quick example. When I was in Uganda, in Kampala, I would see these gated homes and communities, small neighborhoods, but very, very wealthy people, and literally across the street from them would be these cesspool communities where the sewage ran in the streets in little gutters. People had mud and cardboard and tin roofs and homes built out of sticks and whatever else they could find. There was one light bulb in the middle of this community. I saw the same thing down in Cancun, 3 miles outside of shiny white sands beach hotel glittering Cancun are some villages largely populated by the men who come in as day laborers to help keep Cancun clean, and their families, and they live in these houses that are made out of sticks and stones and whatever they can gather. Their water comes from a cenote, deep water cave that is several miles from their village. They have one light bulb in the middle of the city, of that little town, run by a long electrical line that they kindly are able to have courtesy of one wealthy homeowner just outside of their village. This is the way people are living in these places. Their cooking is done with open fires, burning animal dung and sticks and whatever else they can find. Their kids are strapped on the mom's back, breathing smoke from their fires constantly. The mothers and the kids are dying from lung infections, from spoiled food, from drinking water that's just totally unfit for people to consume. And this is the lifestyle that the environmentalists want to perpetuate or allow it to improve just a little bit on the margins by giving them access to a special water filtration system that can do a few gallons per hour, or a wind turbine in their village, or a little solar panel on the top of their hut that will let them power a light bulb and a 1 cubic foot refrigerator.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing that always comes out, and it always makes the most sense, is that when we industrialize, we make life so much easier for the people that live in an industrial economy. And at the same time, the more industrial we become, the more energy saving we do, the more ability we have to reduce the amount of energy that's required to live our daily lives, because we become much more efficient. And that's the efficiency of the free market.
Absolutely. And it's not just with energy. Even take a building today, a modern high-rise building with all the steel that goes into it uses about a third less steel than it did a few decades ago, because the steel is better and the structural design is better. We're using far less aluminum in cans than we did back in the 1960s, about 40-50% less metal in a beverage can. And then look at something like fiber optic cables. We have 1,000-meter fiber optic cable that can carry video and all kinds of other information, and it takes 45 pounds of silica sand, which is almost the most abundant material on Earth, and compare that to the old-fashioned RG6 cable, the same length that took 3,600 pounds of copper and couldn't even carry high-definition video signals. So everything we're doing is miniaturizing the technologies, reducing the number of pounds of raw materials that go into making them, and creating a much more sustainable future. So I think when you're looking at free enterprise and the innovation that it instills everywhere, you're bringing in real sustainability. But on the other hand, the environmentalists push this politicized sustainability, which says we're not supposed to use any resources that future generations are going to require, and somehow predict the technologies and raw material needs that these future generations are going to have and require. It just can't be done. Just think of cell phones 20 years ago. Cell phones were basically a figment of the imagination, or these big clunky things that were in a car, and now we carry more computing power in our pocket than they took on space missions not too many years ago. So that's the kind of technological development that just happens very suddenly, and you can't predict it, nor can you predict the raw materials that will be required to implement those new technologies. So we've got to focus on real sustainability versus the politicized sustainability that seems to drive so many environmental policies. Sustainability is kind of the flip side of global warming, climate change. Both of them are used to justify all these restrictive policies that reduce living standards or keep people from getting the living standards that they aspire to.
You're right on the money, Paul, and I guess to cut to the chase, and this is something you and I have talked about before, it's not really laughable. It's just the fact that when you cut past all the rhetoric and all the so-called warm and fuzzy leftist nonsense that drives the environmental movement, in truth, what we're looking at is hardcore communists at the center of this that want to control every aspect of human life from cradle to grave, and they want to do it in a way where they are the only ones that can determine how humanity is to live. That's, in a nutshell, exactly what drives radical environmentalism. Am I off base to say something like that, Paul?
No, I don't think you are at all. Whether you call it communism or socialism or fascism, they want to be in control of people's lives, in control of businesses and industries. They want to control what information we're allowed to hear or see, who gets to speak and who gets to be silenced. They want to control every aspect of our lives without any accountability for the screw-ups they have, the completely bogus science and other information they propagandize with, or the deliberate harm they inflict on families and industries. I think it's outrageous, and people need to be aware of what's happening and just take a stand against it.
I think we have to. And the one thing that will always stand out in every one of these discussions, every one of these real debates, is that bottom line, we can do much better for humanity with free markets than we can with controlled economies. And,
absolutely. And bear in mind, too, that the people that are doing the controlling are the ones that end up living the best lives. They have the access to the energy, the food, the high living standards, high wages, and so forth. It's kind of like the Hunger Games with the capital, the people living in the capital living very much better than the people out in the various provinces or states. Flyover country, whatever you want to call it as an aspersion. The people in the ruling classes in the ruling urban areas want to control everybody else's lives but live very well themselves. To me, it's just an intolerable situation.
Mm-hmm. It sure is. It's absolutely intolerable. Well, let's talk about some of the things that you've discovered in your travels around the world. You were talking about Uganda and Cancun, but the way these people are forced to live because the radical environmental movement will not allow something as common sense and simple as, let's say, a hydroelectric dam or a some kind of a coal-fired or gas-fired electrical power generation plant. What can we do to make America and the world wake up to the reality that if we eliminate all the cheap sources of power, all the good, inexpensive sources of power that we can make clean energy from, that what is left is much more expensive, and most of these third world countries just can't afford it?
Well, and I think those third world countries are starting to realize that they're being held back not only by their own corrupt governments who lay in billions of dollars of foreign aid and put it in their Swiss bank accounts and give it to their friends and allies, but also by these rabid environmental groups who not only oppose coal-fired and gas-fired power plants, they hate hydroelectric, they hate nuclear, and when it comes down to it, they're going to hate widespread wind and solar operations as well. I'll give you just a quick example. If you've got a natural gas-powered power plant, it will take about 300 acres for a modern cogeneration plant to generate 600 megawatts of electricity, about 95% of the year. And then you take a wind farm that is going to generate 600 megawatts, the same amount of electricity. Instead of 300 acres, it's going to need 50,000 acres, and it's only going to work 30% of the time. So the rest of the time, either you just don't have electricity, or you have to have that gas-fired power plant running. You have to build it, and then you have to run it in the background all the time, so that every time the wind stops blowing, you get electricity. Otherwise, you have electricity when it's available instead of when you need it. And then if you try to go, say we're going to replace the wind, all the electricity that's being generated worldwide every year right now, it would take 100 million wind turbines, every one of them 400 feet tall. They'd cover 1.5 billion acres. That's 80% of the lower 48 United States. And then just think of all the raw materials that would be required to build those turbines and the transmission lines that would have to run hundreds of miles from the windy areas to the urban areas. So either, again, you have no electricity 30, 40, 50, 80% of the time, or you have to have batteries to back them up. And then if you're going to have the battery power, you're going to need tens of billions of Tesla-style batteries. So in the end, the least sustainable resources that we have for energy are the ones the environmentalists claim they support, wind and solar. But they're not going to want 80% of the United States, that kind of land area, covered in wind turbines either. So ultimately, what they're really for is lack of energy for the vast majority of people living in the world. And that's intolerable. It's racist. It's genocidal because it kills people.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. My guest this morning is Paul Dreesen. We had a little bit of a technical glitch here. I got somehow I got off the call early here before the break. But Paul, are you on the line
I am
still?
back on. I'm not sure where I got cut off. Which brilliant comment I was making when I got cut off. But we can pick up wherever that was.
We both got cut off. I guess it must have been a glitch at the board. But we were talking about the electrical grid. I guess is a huge way to describe it. But hydroelectric is by far and away the most efficient, the most reliable, the best way to generate electricity. And yet they have targeted, the radical environmental movement has targeted the destruction of dams and hydroelectric facilities as their number one target of their so-called cleanup of the environment. Tell us why that is so stupid.
Well, we've got to get our electricity from somewhere. And if you go to Washington State, for example, Washington gets 75% of its electricity from hydroelectric. Oregon gets 43%. And that electricity comes from dams and power projects that were built during the 1930s Depression era by our Works Project Administration people. California is in a real lucky position. Their climate is such that almost half of its homes don't have air conditioning, and 20%, maybe 15%, don't even have heating. But California is in the vanguard, of course, of shutting down oil and gas. They have no more coal-powered generation in the state. They want to tear out their hydroelectric facilities. They've torn down their nuclear power plants. And where do they get their electricity now? They get 25 to 30% of their electricity from other states. They import it. That's very nice for California, but not every state can import from other states. Somebody has to be a producer and has to have the hydroelectric plants, the nuclear power plants, the coal-fired power plants, the gas-fired power plants that California doesn't want, but it sure doesn't mind getting electricity from those plants if they're situated, sited in some other state. But pretty soon you run out of other people's energy. As I said, not every state can afford to import 25 to 30% of its electricity from somebody else. So this whole environmental attitude that we see running rampant in California is completely unsustainable, uneconomic, undemocratic. It's illogical. It makes no environmental sense whatsoever. And it causes the highest electricity rates almost in the entire United States. People are paying more than twice as much in California as they are here in Virginia, for example, where I live.
Right. Well, and in California, because of the progressive policies of the loony left, they also have nearly 14% income tax, or sales tax, on top of income tax, property taxes that are just through the roof, and they're still running huge deficits. The bottom line is, anytime you get somebody that is pushing this kind of a radical agenda, I guarantee you they don't have a clue about very basic economics. They don't know how a dollar works.
They don't have a clue. They're also living in a situation where the basic economics really don't apply to them. They're either wealthy Hollywood types or they're government employees who have a guaranteed income and guaranteed pensions that the rest of us don't enjoy.
Right, that's exactly right. What do you see as a future for the United States if we continue to do the kind of crazy policies that the radical left would like to see?
Well, we're going to see far more joblessness, of course. People's living standards are going to go down. Hospitals are going to have to pay twice as much for electricity as they already do. That's going to reduce health care, access to health care, and quality of health care. And, of course, the poor and the middle classes, the working classes, the minorities are going to be impacted the most by all of that. So we're going to go on a downward trend, a downward spiral that's going to leave just a few people in high living standards, wealthy areas living well, and the rest of us are not going to be doing so well. We're going to be forced to deindustrialize and depopulate areas where our living standards, our health are going to go down, our life expectancies will decrease, and at some point there's just going to be an open rebellion against this kind of nonsense. California's rebellion right now is taking place in the form of people leaving California and going to some other states. You're seeing a net outflow of population in California, despite its nice climate. So we're gonna run out of places where people can migrate to if the entire country has to live under the kinds of conditions and prices and taxes and regulations that California lives under. But I see some encouraging signs. Just yesterday, EPA Administrator, Environmental Protection Administration, the Administrator, Scott Pruitt, announced that he is reversing the very undemocratic decision by the Obama EPA to impose 54-mile-per-gallon CAFE standards on automobiles. He's just going to get rid of that, and this was forced down everyone's throats based on pressure from California and the environmentalists who claimed that tailpipe emissions from our vehicles were causing climate change. In the scheme of worldwide coal-fired power plant growth and automobile growth and so forth, that makes no sense at all. But to me, the biggest issue that EPA completely ignored when they rammed these regulations through was smaller, lighter, plasticized, economized cars don't survive crashes very well. So thousands and thousands more people were going to die every year in these accidents, and hundreds of thousands more were going to be maimed and paralyzed and otherwise injured in these lighter weight cars when they collide with other cars or trucks or buses or walls or trees. And EPA didn't pay any attention to any of those human costs. They focused only on the supposed greenhouse gas emissions from cars and trying to save the planet from mythical, catastrophic man-made climate change. So here's one example of where this Trump administration is rolling back some of these insane standards. And of course, we're getting huge pushback from California and the Sierra Club and so forth. But it's the right thing to do. Otherwise, I think we're going to be in for some really nasty internal conflicts, maybe another civil war over this kind of thing, which would be ridiculous.
It really would. And, your observations about how the environmental groups are targeting man as the cause of so-called catastrophic global warming. We've had quite a winter this year in much of the country and worldwide. In many ways, it's been setting record temperatures on the downside in certain areas. How does that all gel with the radical environmental movements shrill, their shrill discussions about how man is ruining the environment.
Yeah, and we're not ruining just the environment, we're ruining Earth's climate. Whether it's wetter or drier, hotter or colder, more storms or fewer storms, they say it's all because of greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide, the plant fertilizing trace gas that makes life on Earth possible, and they're trying to turn it into some sort of a terrible pollutant. You get rid of carbon dioxide, you get rid of plants, you get rid of wildlife, you get rid of humans. But they want to blame carbon dioxide for all the supposed changes in our weather and climate. There aren't, you take a look at climate and weather over the last 100 years, you're seeing very, very little difference from year to year over what you saw 50 or 100 years ago. The planet's maybe a few tenths of a degree warmer, but that's about the only thing you see. Let me give you one quick example. The Hurricane Harvey hit last year. The environmentalists immediately tried to blame that on global warming, climate change, dangerous man-made extreme weather events, and so forth. But Harvey was the first Category 3 to 5 hurricane to hit the United States in a record 12 years. The previous record was 9 years, set back in the 1860s. So if carbon dioxide is responsible for all that bad weather, was maybe carbon dioxide responsible for a 12-year lapse of big hurricanes hitting the United States? I don't think you'll get any environmentalist to accept that idea. But basically, they want to blame any bad thing that happens today on human beings and energy use and modern living standards and the use of fossil fuels. There's no logic to anything they do, but they're well organized, they're well financed, they've got the media on their side, they've got a lot of government bureaucrats on their side, and they are relentless in pushing this particular narrative. Thankfully, a lot of people are listening to your show and reading articles and books by folks like me, and they're getting the truth instead of these crazy propaganda messages. So there is, I think, some hope for the future, but we got to keep the crazies out of their power positions.
Well, we do. We've had really an unrelenting string of nonsensical ideas pushing this green agenda for the last nearly 30 years. Well, actually, it's been well over 30 years, but we've seen a real push since UN Agenda 21 and the conference at Rio de Janeiro in 1991. Since then, we've seen really an amazing amount of focus put on so-called sustainable development. And yet their idea of sustainability, as you pointed out, Paul, is the exact opposite of what we should be doing if we really want a sustainable world.
Yeah, absolutely. And just take one example, back to the pollution issue for a moment. Look at our automobiles. 95% of the pollution that came out of a tailpipe in 1970 is gone. 95%. And yet they're screaming that we've got to get rid of the last 5% by slimming down cars and making them out of more and more plastic and getting these very high, ridiculously high mileage standards, regardless of the impacts on human safety. Sustainable development, again, it's just another mantra to push their particular agenda. If they're in favor of some kind of a technology, regardless of how high the environmental impacts are, whatever the resource demands are, then it's sustainable. If they don't like a technology, then it's not sustainable. That's the basic rule of thumb to follow here. If the environmental movement is against something, they find an excuse in climate change, resource depletion, sustainability to attack it relentlessly. If they like something like wind turbines, it doesn't matter what environmental impacts you have on birds and bats and habitats, what resource demands are required, where those metals come from to make the magnets and turbines and so forth, from terrible places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, where families, including little children, are mining those metals that go into their technologies, their wind turbines, their solar panels, their batteries, their cell phones, their computers, coming from third world places under horrific environmental and human and safety and health standards. They just completely ignore all of that. And that's how they are able to push forward their agenda to the exclusion of common sense resource policies, energy policies, free enterprise systems.
Yeah, you're right on. And, the whole goal is to deindustrialize and to really destroy the United States is the economic and political, let's say, hallmark of the world as being the number one Republican form of government that real freedom comes from, what real capitalism comes from. That is what they're targeting. And
to replace it with what, Dan? What do they have in mind as the replacement? And show me an example of where what they've got in mind has worked anywhere in the world.
And it hasn't. Yeah, it hasn't. I mean, that's the fallacy of the people that are pushing this Marxist or fascist or whatever you want to call it agenda, is that any time you hand control of an entire society over to a handful of people, it ends up being a mess and creating a society that is the exact opposite of what they say they want.
Absolutely. And just look at the death toll from communism. Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot and the rest of those communist dictators murdered, killed over 100 million people in the course of their various 5-year plans and great leaps forward and purges and forced starvations and so forth. And what did they get out of them? What kind of society did they ever get that was good for people or for the environment? And when was any one of those guys ever held to account? Maybe Pol Pot's people, they ultimately tried them and executed a number of them. But Stalin or Mao or any of the rest of them, they continued to live very well. Kim Jong-un in North Korea lives very well compared to the people in his country. But you can never hold these guys to account, no matter what kind of damage they inflict on people, no matter how many millions and millions of people die because of them. And we're seeing the same thing from modern environmentalism, holding people to the horrible living standards they're forced to endure in Africa and other poor, emaciated countries, kills millions of people every single year. But when is an environmentalist ever held to account for any of that? It doesn't happen.
Right. Well, and, I think people don't realize that UN Agenda 21, one of the targets of their policies are that the world's population will be sustained at a level somewhere below 1 billion people. Well, we've got 7 billion people on Earth right now, a little over 7 billion people, and that means we're going to be getting rid of about 92% of the population. What better way, if they're trying to do it, than starving these people to death? And that's exactly, I believe, what they have in mind.
Yeah, and I'm still waiting for some of them who are so worried about overpopulation to step forward and offer to sacrifice themselves and their families and friends as the first wave of mass exterminations to get the population of the planet down to the level they want it at.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea, Paul. I think since they came up with the idea and they came up with the numbers, they should be the ones that step in line the very first to volunteer to be part of the solution.
Yeah, I mean, real leaders lead by example, right?
You are so right. Well, it's funny, but the EPA under the Obama administration classified carbon dioxide as a poisonous gas. Now, the real stupidity of that, I mean, I don't know how many people could possibly miss the stupidity of that kind of a classification. What can we do to make sure that the Trump administration pulls that stupid regulation and turns it completely around?
Well, I think we need to let President Trump and EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt know that we want that so-called endangerment finding reversed. That's the EPA decision during the Obama years, that carbon dioxide somehow endangers the health and welfare of American citizens. Again, they use this term carbon pollution. It's not carbon pollution. Carbon is what we burn when we're using coal or wood or natural gas or oil in the form of hydrocarbons and carbon-based fiber, plant fiber or coal. Carbon dioxide is what comes out of the stack as part of the effluent stream, along mostly with water vapor, thanks to the tremendous improvements in pollution control technologies that we've seen in the last 40 or 50 years. So why would we want to eliminate carbon dioxide from our atmosphere when the increasing carbon dioxide levels are actually improving plant growth tremendously? We've had about a 20% increase in the rate and quality of plant growth in the last 20 or 30 years, and that has greened the planet and rolled back deserts, increased habitats, increased crop growth. So what they're trying to do is turn the science we learned as kids that carbon dioxide makes plants grow, turn that completely on its ear and claim that carbon dioxide is a dangerous pollutant that has to be eliminated. This is just one example of the insanity they're trying to jam down our throats, and we need to fight back and let President Trump know that this kind of stuff should not be the basis of our energy policies, our environmental policies. We need to just go after some more of these Obama-era policies that have no foundation in science or economics or health or safety, and just get rid of them.
I agree. And one of the things that I think most Americans aren't aware of is that carbon dioxide levels right now, even though they've gone up recently, and most of that's due to ocean plankton and that sort of thing. It's not cars that have done that, but it's El Nino is a big cause of the carbon dioxide. But we are at current levels, we're at some of the lowest carbon dioxide levels on the history of the planet. And if we reduce them much more than we were at 100 years ago, we will be at a point where plant growth in this world could be in jeopardy.
Well, that's an excellent point. We are at a very low level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, geologically speaking. Going back millions of years, there were hundreds of times more carbon dioxide than we have today. 400 parts per million is 0.04%, a few pennies out of $1,000. And to suggest that that is somehow bad when it contributes tremendously to plant growth is just the kind of stupidity that we're getting from the modern environmental movement, which is so agenda-driven and so anti-civilization, anti-prosperity, anti-modern living standards, anti-people. and that's just not me speaking. That's Patrick Moore, who is one of the co-founders of Greenpeace. Those are the terms he uses about the modern environmental movement.
Yeah, absolutely. And Paul, we're going to run out of time here. We're going to be hitting the break here shortly. Would you tell our listeners the best way that they can get access to your books, I should say, and some of your writings and some of your research? And I know you do a lot of work for Heartland. Could you tell our listeners the best way that they can learn more about your work?
Yeah, they can find a lot of my articles on townhall.com/columnist/Paul Dreesen. Find things on CFACT, CFACT.org. A lot of my articles are published there. I'm a senior policy advisor with CFACT, with Heartland Institute, and with the Congress of Racial Equality. My books are available through Amazon.com and CFACT, and you'll find my things very easily on the internet. Just search my name, and you'll find more than you can possibly tolerate reading.
Okay. Well, Paul, we're hitting the break here. I want to thank you again for being our guest. Next time that we do this, we can't let it be quite so long. I look forward to the next time we get a chance to get together. And thank you again for being our guest.
It's my pleasure. Anytime you want me, give me a shout. I enjoy being
All righty. Thank you, Paul.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their back confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand that pulls the string.
Well, welcome back to the second hour of Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. And my second hour guest is a lady who appeared on my radio show on Thursday night last week, and she did such a terrific job, and this information is so incredibly powerful that I asked her if she would come back on our second hour today to talk about this subject to our audience on the micro effect. This lady's name is Ann Blake-Tracy. And Ann is one of the foremost really experts in the country on the drugging, the doping of America, and what's been happening in our schools that has been blamed on a gun culture is in fact a problem that's based on a pharmaceutical culture, on a culture of drugging our youth. And I want Ann to maybe give a little bit of background and introduction of herself, because I can't do justice to the quality of guests that we've got on today. And so, Ann, would you tell our listeners a little bit more about some of the projects that you are working on and a little background leading into today's discussion.
Well, where do I start? I've been doing this for almost 30 years now, thinking that people would wake up long before now. I thought it might take a year or two at the most for people to understand what these drugs were doing to us, but I didn't realize how much money I'd be fighting. And I also thought that the drug company would actually care to know that they'd made a huge mistake in their hypothesis behind the use of antidepressants. The very first thing I saw was cravings for alcohol caused by these drugs, and thought, oh my gosh, that's all the world needs is a whole lot more people dealing with the problem of alcoholism in their life. And it just led to more and more. I learned that antidepressants were actually the closest thing we've seen to PCP and LSD, which I found to be very shocking. And then, of course, we've run into all the rest. And I started in 1992 testifying in these cases as an expert witness. In 1997, the doctor who was behind she discovered the process by which these drugs work, making them all possible, and she came out against them in Time magazine, talking about how alarmed she was at the monsters she had helped create, referring to the antidepressants. And I think a lot of patients have never heard her statement, and if I was taking the drug, I'd sure want to know. Anyway, it's just kind of grown from there. And then the doctor who bribed the approval for the drugs for the drug company came forward, and we did the first show here in America that he has done. So it has just kind of grown and grown as I have gathered cases nonstop for the last 30 years, and we've got a huge database of that. I head the International Coalition for Drug Awareness, and we focus mainly on dangerous prescription medications because when people are harmed the most is during the period after the approval by the FDA and before the drug gets pulled from the market. I think most people are completely unaware that nearly every street drug out there started out as a prescription medication. So it's during that period after the approval, the FDA approval, and the removal from the market where the majority of patients are harmed. Like with Vioxx, there were at least 50,000 deaths we know of before people woke up. As far as fen-phen and Redux, it was huge as well. And there needs to be something. And the FDA is not protecting us the way that we think that they are. Not at all.
Right. And in fact, I think one of the things that you've discovered in all your research is the fact that the FDA is really controlled by the pharmaceutical companies, and that much of the process that these approvals has been a process that, quite frankly, wouldn't meet public scrutiny in any way, shape, or form as being a legitimate process.
Well, I think all the public would need to know is the fact that the large majority, very large majority of those that leave the FDA go to work for the pharmaceutical company. So they're not going to bite the hand that feeds them. Right. They know what the process is, and they know that's where they're going to be, and they're not about to do something that's going to disrupt that really cushy job they got waiting for them when they leave.
Right. Well, and I want I want our listeners to understand something. You're not the sort of person to blow your own horn, but the fact is that you've testified before Congress. You've testified before the federal government in any number of occasions on the information that you're bringing forward here, and that you are considered probably, if not the number one expert in the world on this process, certainly the number one expert in the United States on the drugging of America. And I want our listeners to understand just exactly how important it is to not underestimate what you're saying today, because it comes with 30 years plus of research and information and scientific documented evidence that what you're saying today is absolutely, without question, correct.
Thank you. And as I've said before, as much as I know about these drugs, it scares me to death because I know that everyone needs to know this much about these drugs. And you never know when this is going to affect you, whether you take these drugs or not. And I've got cases where decorated police officers have run across the street and killed all the neighbors in that home, run next door, killed all of them, before driving to the next city where his best friend is police chief in an attempt to kill him before killing himself. You don't know when someone is going to reach a point where they're going to go psychotic on these drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And violent.
Well, and you know, everything that's been happening over the last month or so, you know, we're seeing the Parkland incident. Everything is being blamed on guns and on a gun culture, when in fact what we ought to be looking at is the drug culture that provides the let's say the psychotic behavior that creates a problem like this.
Right. In fact, I just put a post out on that just a few days ago, where I asked if owning a gun makes you homicidal and suicidal. And everybody knows that's not true. Owning a bathtub doesn't mean that you're going to suddenly drown your children in it. There's just a whole number of weapons, hammers, kitchen knives, chainsaws, circular saws, baseball bats, crowbars, you name it. I've seen it used as a weapon in these cases. And are we going to ban all those, including planes and trucks and cars, because those are used as well? It makes no sense. The only contributor to all of these cases is an antidepressant that carries a warning of homicidal and suicidal ideation. That's not just killing someone. That's having obsessive, compulsive, ruminating thoughts of killing and how to do it, whether it's yourself or someone else. That's pretty bad. Why do we allow it? Why is it okay to have a prescription drug on the market that we know can cause homicidal and suicidal ideation? That's my biggest question. Whose idea was this? Not mine.
Right. Well, and the fact that Big Pharma has been in control of so much of our government process for so very long. I mean, we talked about this last Thursday on the show, the fact that Big Pharma has paid literally trillions of dollars over 100-plus year period, and now they are the number one contributor of political contributions to Congress. They're even higher than banking as far as the amount of contributions that they put into political campaigns.
Right. Yep, they're the wealthiest corporations on the planet that I know of.
Well, they are. They are. And, we talked about, on the Thursday night show, we talked about how the government has experimented with people, and literally the government has caused many, 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 many deaths and disease in the process of trying to find out scientific information. That's happened by our own government, experimentation on the American people. But so many of the things that happened prior to the 1960s, those have been turned on hyperdrive since we've started drugging the youth, started using drugs in school situations. Can you talk about how all that evolved, how that process evolved from the 1950s on through until what we've got today, which is a very heavy drug culture in our school systems?
True. Well, it actually started with the CIA having an obsession with LSD. That was their drug of choice. They wanted it for a mind control program because wasn't it during the Korean War? They were getting our troops and drugging them into mind control. So they wanted to counter that, and LSD was what they felt was the best drug for it. Well, it was being produced by Sandoz Pharmaceutical in Switzerland. So they took 80% of their initial budget and sent a couple of agents to Switzerland to buy up all the LSD that Sandoz Pharmaceutical Company had. When they got there, they found out that Sandoz only had a few ounces because they were actually growing the ergot fungus that LSD comes from. They were growing it on their own and producing it naturally. Well, they said, this isn't going to work. We need a whole bunch more than this if we're going to use it for mind control. So they grabbed their brown paper bag and came back to the United States and went straight to Eli Lilly Pharmaceutical Company and told them that they needed a synthetic version of the drug so they could use it for mind control. Lilly offered to deliver it to them by the truckload and prepared their patent on the drug. And just before it came out, this drug that was being used by Sandoz to chemically induce insanity, why they didn't have any buyers, it suddenly became a drug that was going to cure mental illness and cure alcoholism and aid in psychoanalysis. So Lilly just put out their own marketing that miraculously changed the drug overnight. Then Congress stepped in and they banned LSD. So reporters asked the CIA what on earth they were going to do now that their drug of choice was no longer available. What they said in response should send chills down the spine of every American. And that is, well, we will look to the pharmaceutical companies to see what they come up with in the way of a drug used for psychoanalysis that we can then use for mind control. So, in no time, Eli Lilly came out with Prozac. the way Prozac works, and all of the other antidepressants. So we've all heard that serotonin is this wonderful chemical in our brain that we need to increase in order to be happy. There could be nothing further from the truth. Serotonin is the chemical in the brain that LSD and PCP mimic to produce hallucinations. It is another way to chemically induce psychosis, exactly what they had gone after in the beginning. The only difference is this does it gradually over a period of time as it blocks the serotonin from leaving the brain. So what you get is a very gradual psychotic break. It slowly takes you into psychosis so that it looks like you're going crazy instead of it being an effect of the drug, because it's not immediate with most people. With some, it has been. We've got cases where I worked on a case where a man took only 2 doses and ended up killing his entire family. The jury ruled that those 2 pills were the main cause of that murder-suicide, too. People need to see the evidence that's coming out in court. You want to know the truth about these drugs, you go there.
Right, right. Well, and you know, what you're describing with the CIA, I think a lot of our listeners are aware of the program called MK Ultra, which was a CIA program for mind control. And if you think this is a conspiracy theory, it's public knowledge. It's been published as something that is, in fact, a very strong reality, and it's been admitted by our own government.
Yeah, it definitely has. There's all kinds of information out on MK Ultra.
Yeah.
What's really interesting is in Operation Paperclip by the CIA, that is where they brought 1,600 Nazi scientists over here after World War II. I was really shocked to learn that. I had no idea.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, did we bring them to twiddle their thumbs? Of course not. And it's like this whole country is turned into a Dachauer Auschwitz.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's where Werner von Braun came, and our whole rocket program, our whole space program was a result of German engineers who were brought over. Well, at the same time they were bringing German engineers, they were also bringing German chemists and pharmaceuticals and this sort of thing over with that same group during Operation Paperclip.
Right. And who was in charge of Operation Paperclip? George Bush Sr.
Yeah.
So when these drugs tried to pass the approval process for the FDA, they weren't getting anywhere. He changed to a fast-track program where drugs would then be approved on only 5- and 6-week studies. And it was able to make it onto the market. Of course, it helped. They bribed the approval over in Sweden, which had really strict guidelines so that the other countries would just not even blink in their approval process.
No, that's right. That's right. Well, and something that you were talking about when we were offline here, or off the program over the weekend, talking about how even things such as vitamins now have some pharmaceutical influence. These pharmaceutical companies are literally trying to insert themselves in every aspect, including natural things like vitamins.
Oh, yeah. In fact, they've convinced the whole natural community that they need to increase serotonin any way that they can. So they're putting out natural things that do increase serotonin, which can be just as harmful. I mean, possibly, let's see, the most common thing to induce this in the general public would be the milk protein. So, you know, as you continue to eat dairy products, the serotonin level will go up. They've taken autistic children and schizophrenic children off dairy, and sugar is another one. And they've had 80% of them had all their symptoms disappear.
Really? Wow.
Autism and schizophrenia. Amazing.
Well, our whole culture is really now artificially being manipulated with this sort of thing.
That's right. If you can make everybody crazy, why bother to fight them? You just walk in and take over the country, right?
Yeah. Well, we certainly have seen a huge push now to repeal or do something to eliminate our Second Amendment rights, and they're blaming the entire thing on a gun culture, when in fact even Michael Moore, after viewing your information, admitted that he had been dead wrong when he made the movie Bowling for Columbine.
That's right.
Tell our listeners about that. I think that's really funny. Tell our listeners about his admission to you.
Well, he didn't admit it to me. He did it on a movie that we did together called The Drugging of Our Children. So he made it public. And this was not long after he had done the movie Bowling for Columbine. And he called everything that they covered in the movie BS. He said it's pretty clear that these drugs are the reason why Columbine happened. But I had Mark Taylor, the first boy shot at Columbine, take a copy of my book to Michael Moore during the premiere of his movie, Bowling for Columbine. And it was after reading that and seeing all the data that we have on it that he made that statement. And it is on our website. People can go there and find a whole list of all the school shootings, what medication they were on, when they did it. They can view a movie, just a short video clip of the only school shooter to ever speak out. And everyone needs to see that. This kid was a solid, great American kid that you could ever find. Just a farm boy out of eastern Washington, hard worker, got on great. And yet, they put him on this because he was shy. I mean, my gosh, I was shy growing up. I was voted the most bashful in my senior class. I would have been a perfect candidate, apparently. So, anyway, here's this shy kid. He's over the youth group at his church. He's about to become an Eagle Scout. I mean, he almost finished his Eagle Scout award. And then he was preparing to serve a 2-year mission for his church. And all of a sudden, they switch him from one medication to another. And he says he doesn't feel very good. They take him up to the highest dose, and that day he told his parents he didn't feel well. So he was going to go back to bed for a little while and then go to school. Well, he said, I woke up in juvenile detention. And he had no memory of what had happened. They had to tell him why he was there because he didn't know. But he had taken a gun to school and held his classmates at gunpoint for 45 minutes.
Wow.
Altering between holding the gun under his chin and holding it on his classmates. And in fact, one of the kids asked him while he was doing it, they just said, Corey, what are you going to do with that gun? Are you going to hurt us? And they said he looked down at the gun like, oh my gosh, there's a gun in my hand. Like he had no idea, because it's called a REM sleep disorder, and they know that 86% of those being diagnosed with this deadly sleep disorder that has long been known to include both murder and suicide, 86% of those being diagnosed with it are taking an antidepressant.
Wow. That's an indictment.
Yeah. That's why we've had court cases where they've said the evidence is clear. These drugs are what are causing this. I was the expert in comedian Phil Hartman's murder-suicide, and that is what happened to his wife. You get to where the nightmares that you have are so extremely vivid that you can't tell the difference between them and reality. And there's no paralysis during sleep, thus allowing you to get up and act out whatever you're dreaming.
Right.
So, and these drugs...
It sounds like we're moving into a break, but please hold those thoughts because we'll pick it up on the other side of the break.
Micro Effect.
The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Before we get back into our discussion with Ann about the drugging of America, I want to mention to our listeners that tomorrow, Debbie Boscalupi's Radioactive Wednesday show will be on. I highly recommend that our listeners tune into that show. It will be from 8 till 10 a.m. Pacific time. And her show tomorrow, she will be talking with several sheriffs. The first, Sheriff John Lope of Siskiyou, sorry, Debbie, County in California, about the dams, marijuana, and Second Amendment, and then Sheriff Glenn Palmer from John Day County or the town of John Day in Oregon will be talking about gun rights in the day that Lavoy Finicum was murdered. Debbie's got a terrific show, and I really urge our listeners to tune in her show. She's doing a fantastic job. So with that, Ann, I want to get back to the discussion. You were talking about this young man who discovered, literally, he was almost a model young man, and he woke up in juvenile detention and realized that he had held his classmates at gunpoint, and he had no recollection of it.
That's right. To this day, he has no recollection of it.
Well, this is kind of a common thread, isn't it, with these type of drugs, is that we have tremendous lapses of memory and literally blank places that people can't account for.
Yes, it is very common, and That's why patients should have been warned that this sleep disorder was a possibility. That's how common it is. I mean, 86%? This should be headline news.
Mm-hmm.
Why isn't it? I think we know they're bought and paid for. Trump is right.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a problem in our society, is that sometimes we don't identify the real problem, and we allow the people that are causing the problem to take over our institutions. And that's certainly been the case, and quite frankly, I think that's the case with our Congress too. They're very beholden to the drug companies. Can you talk about how much the pharmaceutical companies are contributing to election campaigns?
Oh, huge amounts. In fact, if people want to go in and do a Google search, they can find out with each candidate how much they're getting from pharmaceuticals. They buy up everyone. When I did the Lisa Gibbons show on mothers on these drugs killing their children, we were told as we walked onto the stage, and I brought a fellow with me whose wife had just killed their 2 children and herself. It was only 90 days before we did the show. They had the nerve to tell us as we stepped onto the stage, you can say the word antidepressant, but you cannot say the brand names of these drugs because of our advertisers. So even though we did that, her show was cut within 3 months after we did it.
Oh, really?
They don't want it out there.
Well, I know that a lot of what we talk about offline certainly, but in general is labeled as being conspiracy theorist. But the fact is, and
well, conspiracy is
person,
lying. Isn't conspiracy lying in order to make money? That is
exactly.
what this is.
Well, and the thing is, there is a difference between conspiracy theory and conspiracy fact. And what conspiracy is 2 or more people coming together to accomplish something that they don't want to known or made public, so that people really know what they're up to. And that has happened a lot with Big Pharma.
Oh, yeah. Yep, for sure. They don't want anything cutting into their profits. That's why there's so many gag orders. They have these secret settlements where they settle with the companies on these wrongful death suits and then pay them and put a gag order on the families so that they cannot talk about it. And so nobody knows that they're paying out billions of dollars to these families to keep it quiet. And the families have lost, and oftentimes their breadwinner. They can't afford to lose what little they've gotten from the pharmaceutical companies through the death of their loved ones.
Mm-hmm.
It is really sick.
It is gag money, and it's awful, the fact that it's been that way.
Should be illegal.
There's so many things that have happened over the course of history that have been part of the plan to change humanity and control through mind control experiments and this sort of thing. I know that you are aware of a project called Codex Alimentarius. I know that you're aware of a company called IG Farben, who was a major pharmaceutical drug company in Germany that was the inventor of the the company that made Zyklon B, the gas that they used in the death chambers at Auschwitz and Dachau and these areas. I don't know if people are aware of this, but the gentleman who was the head of IG Farben spent several years. He was tried at Nuremberg, and he spent several years in prison for his part in that. And when he got out of prison, he was given a job by Julian Huxley, who was the head of UNESCO, to put together a program called Codex Alimentarius. Ann, can you talk at all about this program? Because this is the sort of thing that our listeners need to understand is happening throughout our culture, and it's not just a national problem, it's an international problem.
Oh, it is. It is. I can't keep up with the cases. In New Zealand, 25% of the population are on these drugs. In Australia, 18% of the population is on the drugs. In America, who knows how high it is. They do everything they can to keep that quiet. We use 80% of all prescription drugs manufactured. So it's definitely an international problem. And I thought everyone knew that IG Farben was behind World War II and the camps, the death camps. They were medical experimentation. But I also heard that when they were ordered to dismantle their company, that they agreed to break up into small companies and then gradually begin to merge again.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that happening all over the place. These companies are merging together. I believe Pfizer at this point is the biggest. It's really scary to watch it going on because they're becoming such a force in our world today. I just kind of hold my breath watching. But one thing before we go any further about anything else is I need to warn everyone that this REM sleep disorder that we're talking about that Corey went into when he took a gun to school, that has always been known as a drug withdrawal state. So if 86% of those being diagnosed today are taking an antidepressant, do we yet have any idea how high that percentage would be in those coming off these drugs and in withdrawal? We don't.
Right.
So you need to be extremely careful coming off of the drugs. You have to go very, very, very slowly in order to avoid the worst withdrawal effects, which could include this deadly sleep disorder. So I have an hour and a half long CD letting people know how and why you need to come off this slowly, and different natural things that can help you to rebuild and avoid those horrible side effects. So people need to know that that's available on our site. They need to be very, very careful coming off of these. And most people just shave a few granules off at a time to come off, and they take months and years to wean off safely. I had one doctor's wife I helped. She weaned the way she should to come off of her antidepressants, but then she had to keep a pill with her to lick it occasionally to avoid the horrible withdrawal.
Wow.
And these are drugs they're going to prescribe to people coming off opioids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the problem. Listeners, how this drug works, how the process works, and why it's so important that they be very careful in the way that they withdraw from the use of these drugs. And you explained it during our Thursday night show, how that process works. So please tell our listeners today the same thing, because I think it's important that people realize how these drugs actually impact your brain and how they work, and how why it's so important to be very careful in the way that you withdraw from the use of these drugs.
Well, probably the most important thing to understand, which many doctors do not know, because this study was done in Italy, where they do not have to report the results here in the U.S. It was ordered by Eli Lilly, the makers of Prozac, and they found that one single 30-milligram dose of Prozac will double the cortisol level, which you may as well be on steroids. If you remember the Robin Williams movie about L-Dopa, anyway, it was the drug for Parkinson's, I believe. There's a doctor that's interviewed. He's interviewing a doctor there, and the doctor said, "You don't understand how long it took medical science to understand that with steroids, and this is such a strong steroid effect to double the cortisol level." He said it took us forever to learn that our patients were going to go psychotic if we didn't wean them very, very gradually up and very, very gradually down. And they should only stay on the drug for a very short time. We've got people who've been on these for 20, 30 years now. So the body needs time to adjust all of its hormone levels after taking the drug for so long. So that's the main thing, is it just takes time to rebuild as you slowly pull the drug away from the system. But increasing cortisol, that's how they test to see if you're depressed, is if you have elevated cortisol. And yet one single dose of Prozac doubles it. So you've got all kinds of people that were given the drug for insomnia, which is ridiculous. Nothing causes it faster than an antidepressant. Stomach problems. I had a little girl that was given these drugs for warts and committed suicide. You know, it's not given just for depression, but these people end up depressed because they've taken the drug that actually causes the depression by the effect on the cortisol level.
That's incredible. And she was given this for warts?
Warts, yeah. And what did the drug company try to prove in court? That the suicide was caused by warts, not their drug.
Wow.
It didn't fly in court.
That's amazing.
So,
well, Ann, I'd like you to talk about your company and your, I guess I should call it organization, and the projects that you're working on, because I think it's important that our listeners know where they can go to learn more about you and the information that you're trying to provide today. Obviously, we're trying to pound a lot of information into a very short time frame. If, in fact, they go to your sites and they go to your information, they can find out a lot more about this subject. So tell our listeners where they can find all this information that you're talking about.
Well, I think I've practically rewritten my entire book on our website, one piece at a time. But we've got tons of information there. Our website's been up since '95, so there's, almost 25 years worth of information up there. besides all the information from my book that I had before that. So just about anything you'd want to know about has been put up there. Just go in and search for what it is that you're most interested in. There's information on the birth defects these drugs cause, and it's not just birth defects at birth. It's impairments that we're finding years down the road with these children. So it is just really awful. We've learned that it's causing learning disabilities. It causes around the time of puberty that they go into depression and anxiety. These are known birth defects for these drugs. You mess up somebody's serotonin level, you're going to be causing all of these things.
Right.
And that's, these kids are being exposed as their bodies develop, as their brains develop. And doctors are telling them. I had a patient tell me just last night on one of our Facebook groups. We've got Facebook groups for every one of these drugs got the name of the drug and then should be illegal after the name of the drug. But a woman from over in England said, my doctor told me there'd be no problem at all with these drugs. I just miscarried. I said, well, what do you think they've been given forever to induce labor? Serotonin. The main thing that it does is constrict muscle tissue. So that's how you put somebody in labor, and all these women are having miscarriages, and apparently they don't even know it's being caused by the drug.
Wow.
She didn't know. And
That's
she was wanting
amazing.
to have a baby. It's going to be a long time.
That is amazing. Well, one thing I want to mention to our listeners is that you are going to be one of our speakers. You're going to be on a panel with, and I believe with Del Bigtree, who produced the movie Vaxxed. And I know that you're going to be there as well in that same panel, and that is at our Red Pill Expo that will be coming up this summer in Spokane, Washington. And if people are interested in learning more and seeing more firsthand and meeting Anne, as well as Del and a number of other people that are studying these very subjects, you need to go to www.redpillexpo.com. redpillexpo.com, and find out about getting tickets to that event, because this is going to be huge. On the venue of the Red Pill Expo is the drugging of America. And you've done a terrific job for America. I think people need to be really grateful for the work that you've done. And your website is www.drugawareness.org. And
right.
That is where there's all kinds of information and videos and access to your books and all sorts of things. Is there anything that you'd like our listeners to know before we end the program?
Everything I know is what I'd like them to know, but
yeah.
I don't know if I could
that's
go
good.
through that. Please learn everything that you can. Please, especially before you try to discontinue the drug. That is probably the worst mistake anybody can make, is to abruptly discontinue one of these drugs. That's what happened with Corey, is they took him off the one drug way too fast and added the other one way too fast. And the FDA has warned that if you do that, it can cause suicide, hostility, or psychosis. So
Right.
please learn that before you just quit.
And I think the other lesson that we should leave our listeners with is, if you are told that your children or you need to go on antidepressants, be incredibly aware and conscious of the problems that these drugs give. And before you make that decision, and certainly before you make that decision for your children, read and learn and go to Ann's site and find out more about how these drugs work. And I think there's a lot better ways to get through some of these problems than drugging is.
There are many alternatives, and we got them all listed there, too.
Okay. Well, that's great. Well, Ann, as always, it's been terrific having you as a guest on the program, and I really look forward to the Red Pill Expo, and I'm sure we're going to be talking again before then. But I want to thank you for everything you've done on behalf of the American people to make sure that they are aware of the issues of the drugging of America. And before we go after the Second Amendment, we need to expose the pharmaceutical industry for the problems that they're creating within our culture.
Right. For sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, Ann, thank you again for being our guest, and please consider being a guest again on our radio show, Connecting the Dots. And I will stay in touch with you, and we'll look forward to the next time.
All right.